Marie Antoinette, hated by the people, condemned to the guillotine. The silence of the conciergerie is not the silence of peace, but the silence of a void. It is the heavy, damp quiet of a stone tomb where time has ceased to be a linear progression and has become a crushing weight. In the early hours of an October morning in 1793, a woman sits on a wooden stool, her back straight, despite the exhaustion that has settled into her very marrow. She is 37 years old, but her hair is white, bleached by the sheer psychological terror of the last few years. The room smells of salt, old sweat, and the metallic tang of the River Seine seeping through the walls. This is the woman who once commanded the most glittering court in Europe, a woman whose every movement was once a choreographed display of absolute power. Now she is reduced to a number, a prisoner, a biological specimen awaiting the final stroke of a political machine that has no use for her humanity. There is a specific kind of sound that a pair of scissors makes when cutting through hair, a dry, rhythmic snapping. As the executioner's assistant shears her locks to ensure the blade of the guillotine finds no resistance, the white strands fall to the floor like discarded silk. Each snip is a severance from her past, from her titles, and from the illusion that her life belonged to her. The guillotine, resting in the Place de la Révolution, is not just a tool of death. It is the physical manifestation of a new era, a cold, rational, and indifferent witness to the collapse of an entire world. To understand how the daughter of an empress became the victim of a mob, one must look into the suffocating intimacy of her rise and the terrifying speed of her decay. To look back at the beginning is to see a young girl being traded across a border, like a piece of high-stakes currency. At 14, Maria Antonia was a political pawn, a sacrifice offered to the altar of a fragile peace between the houses of Habsburg and Bourbon. At the border of France, she was subjected to a ritual of symbolic annihilation. She was stripped of her Austrian clothes, her possessions, and even her childhood pets, forced to stand naked in a wooden pavilion on an island in the middle of a river. This was the first death of Marie Antoinette, the death of her identity. She was dressed in French finery and handed over to a court that viewed her with a mixture of lust and suspicion. She was the Austrian woman, a foreigner in a land that equated its own cultural superiority with the divine will of God. Versailles was not a home. It was a panopticon of golden mirrors, where every waking moment was a public performance. The Queen's morning levee was an exercise in systematic humiliation, where duchesses of varying ranks fought for the privilege of handing her a chemise or pouring her water. In this environment, the human heart is forced to atrophy. Every smile is scrutinized for political intent, every silence interpreted as a slight. She was surrounded by thousands of courtiers, yet she lived in a vacuum. Her husband, Louis XVI, was a man of quiet intelligence but profound social paralysis, a king who preferred the solitary precision of lock-making to the messy, volatile business of ruling a nation in the throes of an identity crisis. Their marriage, unconsummated for 7 agonizing years, became a source of national ridicule, a private failure projected onto the public stage. The vacuum of her life was filled with the only things she was allowed to possess: aesthetics and distraction. She sought refuge in the Petit Trianon, a private estate where she could pretend the world of etiquette did not exist. She built a rustic village, a fantasy of peasant life where she could play at being a shepherdess, unaware that while she was enjoying the pastoral dream, the real peasants of France were eating grass to survive. This was not born of malice, but of a profound systemic disconnect. Power, when it is absolute, creates its own weather system. Inside the bubble of Versailles, the air was perfumed and still. Outside, a storm was gathering, fueled by a decade of bad harvests, a bankrupt treasury, and the rising intellectual fervor of the Enlightenment. The people did not just want bread. They wanted to dismantle the idea that one family's blood was inherently more sacred than their own. Marie Antoinette became the focal point for this resentment. She was the perfect villain for a burgeoning revolutionary press. Every debt she accrued at the gambling tables, every diamond she wore, was transformed into a weapon. The diamond necklace affair, a complex web of fraud and impersonation in which she was entirely innocent, became the final nail in the coffin of her reputation. The public did not care about the facts. They cared about the narrative. The narrative was that the Queen was a decadent foreign parasite who was draining the lifeblood of France. The monarchy was losing its sacred aura, and as the mystery of the crown dissolved, it was replaced by a visceral, animalistic hatred. The transition from resentment to revolution is often marked by a single moment where the invisible barrier of authority simply vanishes. For Marie Antoinette, that moment arrived in October 1789. The sky over Versailles was a bruised purple, and the rain fell with a relentless cold intensity. A mob of thousands, led by the market women of Paris, had marched 12 miles through the mud, driven by a hunger that had finally eclipsed their fear of the king's guards. They were not a political delegation, they were a force of nature. As they reached the palace gates, the centuries of tradition that protected the monarchy began to liquefy. The Queen was awakened in the middle of the night by the sound of splintering wood and the screams of her bodyguards. She fled through a secret passage, her feet bare on the cold stone, as the mob tore through her bedchamber, shredding her bed with pikes. This was the physical breach of her sanctuary, a violation that signaled the end of the old world. When she was forced to stand on the balcony before the screaming thousands, she was looking into the face of her own executioner. The crowd demanded that the royal family return to Paris, a journey that would take them from the isolated splendor of Versailles to the suffocating scrutiny of the Tuileries Palace. The carriage ride to Paris lasted 9 hours. It was a slow-motion descent into hell. The carriage was surrounded by a sea of people, carrying the severed heads of the Queen's bodyguards on pikes, their faces smeared with flour and blood. This was the moment the French Revolution ceased to be an intellectual debate and became a visceral, irreversible reality. Marie Antoinette sat inside the cramped, sweltering carriage, clutching her children, listening to the taunts of the people who called her the baker's wife. She was no longer a goddess, she was a hostage. The move to Paris was not just a change of address, it was a shift in the nature of power. The king and queen were now under house arrest, living in a palace that felt more like a cage, surrounded by National Guardsmen who looked at them with eyes full of revolutionary fervor. The silence of the palace was gone, replaced by the constant, low hum of the city, a city that was beginning to realize it could survive, and perhaps even thrive, without a king. In this pressurized environment, every choice became a negotiation with death. The queen, ever the daughter of an empress, began to secretively correspond with foreign powers, hoping for a rescue that would never come. She was playing a high-stakes game of shadows, unaware that the revolutionary government was intercepted her letters, building a case of treason that would eventually lead her to the blade. The tragedy of Marie Antoinette is the tragedy of a woman who was never taught how to see the world as it truly was. She was a product of a system designed to insulate power from reality, and when that reality finally broke through, it did so with a violence that was as incomprehensible to her as her lifestyle was to the poor. She lived in a state of constant, low-grade paranoia, watching as the people she trusted emigrated or joined the revolutionary cause. The world was shrinking, the walls were closing in, and the guillotine was being assembled in the mind of the nation long before it was built in the square. It stood there, a silent, conceptual presence, waiting for the moment when the people would decide that the only way to truly be free was to wash the streets in the blood of those who had once ruled them. As she sat in her cell years later, reflecting on those final days at Versailles, she must have realized that her greatest sin was not her extravagance, but her inability to understand that the people she looked down upon from her balcony were the very ones who would eventually hold her life in their hands. The revolution was a machine, and she was the fuel it needed to reach its maximum velocity. The transition from the silk of the palace to the straw of the dungeon was not a mistake of history, it was a cold, procedural inevitability. The stage was set, the audience was hungry, and the Queen was finally ready to play her final, most difficult role. To the Tuileries Palace is a labyrinth of echoes and voyeurism, a grand architectural corpse where the monarchy is being slowly dissected by the gaze of the masses. In these rooms, the air is thick with the scent of unwashed soldiers and the metallic tang of unsheathed bayonets. Marie Antoinette no longer wakes to the gentle rituals of her chambermaids. She wakes to the heavy tread of National Guardsmen outside her door, men whose eyes hold no reverence, only a cold, scrutinizing hunger for her downfall. Privacy, the ultimate luxury of the soul, has been confiscated. She is watched while she eats, while she prays, and while she stares out of windows that have become bars. The mirrors that once reflected her beauty now seem to mock her, capturing the hollows beneath her eyes and the premature streaks of grey in her hair. To be a queen in this state is to be a living ghost, a relic of a world that the streets of Paris are determined to bury. Every letter she writes is a desperate gamble. Every word she whispers to her husband is intercepted by the heavy silence of the walls. There is a specific kind of terror in realizing that your very existence has become a provocation. The guillotine is not yet visible in the courtyard, but its presence is felt in the way the guards sharpen their blades and the way the mob screams her name in the dead of night. It is a conceptual monster, growing limbs, feeding on the resentment that has been simmering for centuries. The queen is no longer a person. She is a target, a symbol of everything that must be destroyed for the new world to be born. The situation outside the palace walls is a fever that will not break. The revolution, once a series of demands for bread and representation, has mutated into a psychological obsession with purity and betrayal. The royal family is living in a state of suspended animation, waiting for a rescue that feels increasingly like a mirage. It was in this atmosphere of suffocating tension that the decision was made to flee. The flight to Varennes was not merely an escape attempt, it was a desperate bid to reclaim a lost reality. On a moonless night in June 1791, the Queen dressed in the simple clothes of a governess, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She moved through the shadows of the Tuileries, guided by the Swedish Count Axel von Fersen, a man whose devotion was perhaps the only genuine thing left in her crumbling universe. The plan was elegant in its desperation. A heavy, lumbering carriage would carry the royal family toward the border, toward the safety of loyalist troops, and the promise of a counter-revolution. But power, once lost, creates a gravity that is impossible to escape. They travelled not as fugitives, but as a ghost of the court, the carriage laden with silver, fine wines, and the arrogance of those who believe their presence is still divine. They moved too slowly, burdened by the very weight of their status. The failure at Varennes was a tragedy of recognition. At a small post-house, a man named Drouet looked at a piece of paper currency and then at the face of the king. He did not see a sovereign. He saw a fugitive. He saw a man who had abandoned his people. The bells of the town began to ring, a discordant, terrifying sound that signaled the end of the escape. The royal family was forced back into the carriage, surrounded by a growing, angry crowd. The return journey to Paris was a funeral procession for the monarchy. For 4 days they travelled through a gauntlet of hatred. People spat at the carriage windows. They screamed obscenities that stripped the queen of her dignity and her humanity. It was during these long, sweltering hours that Marie Antoinette realized the true nature of her predicament. The people did not just want her gone, they wanted her to suffer. She sat in the stifling heat, her children huddled against her, watching as the landscape of France turned into a vast open-air prison. By the time they reached the Tuileries, her hair had turned white from the sheer psychological trauma of the journey. She was no longer the Austrian, she was the traitor. In the aftermath of the flight, the internal world of the Queen became a landscape of fortified isolation. She began to see the revolution not as a political movement, but as a demonic force that had possessed the nation. Her husband, Louis, had retreated into a state of profound apathy. A man who had given up on the world before the world had given up on him. She was left to be the spine of the family, the one who negotiated with the radical leaders, the one who reached out to her brother, the Emperor of Austria, begging for an invasion that would restore order. This was her fatal mistake. In her mind, she was a mother protecting her children and a wife protecting her husband's legacy. In the eyes of the French people, she was a foreign spy inviting an enemy army to slaughter French citizens. Every secret letter she sent was a brick in the wall of her own tomb. She was trapped in a paradox. The more she tried to save her family, the more she justified the violence of her enemies. She felt the noose tightening, not around her neck yet, but around the very idea of her life. She began to live for the small moments, the touch of her son's hand, the quiet prayers in the morning, knowing that each one might be the last. The turning point arrived with the heat of August 1792. Paris was a tinderbox, and the declaration of war against Austria had provided the spark. The Queen was now the sister of the enemy, a hostage in a city that expected to be bombarded at any moment. On the morning of August 10th, the tocsin began to ring across the city, a relentless metallic heartbeat that signaled the final assault. Thousands of armed citizens and federated soldiers converged on the Tuileries. The king, in a final act of indecision, refused to let his Swiss guards fire on the crowd until it was too late. Marie Antoinette watched from the windows as the mob breached the gates. She heard the screams of the guards being slaughtered, the sound of steel meeting bone. She felt the physical vibration of the palace being torn apart. This was the end of the illusion. The royal family fled through the gardens, stepping over the bodies of their defenders, to seek refuge in the Legislative Assembly. They were placed in a tiny, cramped box used by newspaper reporters, the Loge du Logographe. For 18 hours they sat in this suffocating space, listening to the deputies debate the abolition of the monarchy. The Queen sat in the shadows, her face a mask of frozen dignity, while her son slept in her lap. Outside, the massacre continued. The Swiss guards, abandoned by their king, were hunted down and killed with a ferocity that defied description. Their bodies were mutilated, their uniforms stripped, their heads carried on pikes. Inside the assembly, the air was thick with the smell of sweat and the rhetoric of a new republic. The monarchy was dead, replaced by a cold, legalistic determination to erase the past. When the sun rose, the royal family was no longer the first family of France. They were prisoners of the Commune. They were taken to the Temple, a grim medieval fortress that had once belonged to the Knights Templar. As the heavy iron gates swung shut behind them, the Queen felt the finality of the sound. The temple was not a palace. It was a stone box designed to crush the spirit. There were no mirrors here, no silk hangings, no echoes of Versailles. There was only the damp cold of the stone and the constant presence of the guards who blew tobacco smoke in her face and sang ribald songs about her execution. The king was separated from her, his title stripped, referred to only as Louis Capet. The revolution had moved from the streets into the very heart of her family life. Every interaction was a humiliation, every meal a reminder of their fall. The Queen spent her days trying to maintain a semblance of education for her children, teaching them history and geography, while their own world was being rewritten by the guillotine. The guillotine was now a physical reality, standing in the Place de la Révolution, its blade catching the pale light of the Parisian sky. It had become the ultimate arbiter of truth, the machine that would resolve the tension between the old world and the new. Marie Antoinette could hear the distant roar of the crowds as the blade fell for others, a rhythmic, mechanical sound that haunted her dreams. She knew that the machine was waiting for her, that the trial of her husband was only the beginning of a process that would inevitably lead to her own end. The revolution had become a monster that needed to be fed, and she was the most precious sacrifice it could claim. She sat in the dim light of the temple, watching the shadows dance on the walls, realizing that the crown she had worn was not a symbol of power, but a target. The transition was complete. The girl who had been traded for peace was now the woman who would be slaughtered for the sake of a new violent order. The silence of the temple was the silence of a waiting blade. 3. The drums of Paris do not merely beat, they consume. On the morning of January 21st, 1793, the rhythmic thud of 10,000 skins, stretched tight over wooden frames, echoed through the stone walls of the temple prison, vibrating in the very marrow of Marie Antoinette's bones. It was a sound designed to drown out the voice of a king, a wall of noise that separated the old world from the new with surgical precision. As Louis XVI stepped onto the scaffold in the Place de la Révolution, his wife sat in a state of catatonic stillness, her ears strained to catch the moment the drums stopped. When the silence finally arrived, it was more violent than any roar. It was the silence of a vacuum, the sound of 1,000 years of divine right being severed by a heavy blade of steel. In that moment, she was no longer a queen consort or a partner in power. She was the widow Capet, a biological remnant of a dead system. The air in her room felt thinner, the light more brittle. The guillotine had claimed its primary prize, but its appetite was not sated. It remained in the square, a tall, gaunt spectre of wood and iron, its blade stained and waiting. For Marie Antoinette, the death of her husband was the beginning of a cold, procedural erasure of her own humanity. She was no longer being guarded as a prisoner of state, but as a piece of evidence in a trial that had already reached its conclusion in the hearts of the people. The mourning clothes she donned were not just a sign of grief, but a shroud she would wear for the remainder of her days. A black uniform for a woman who was now walking through the corridors of her own ghost story. The psychological warfare of the revolution shifted its focus toward the only thing the Queen had left: her children. In the months following the King's execution, the Committee of Public Safety realized that as long as the young Dauphin, Louis Charles, remained with his mother, he was a symbol of hope for the monarchists. To break the Queen, they had to break the mother. On a humid night in July, municipal officers entered her room with a decree that the boy was to be separated from her and placed under the care of a tutor who would instill in him the virtues of the Republic. The scene that followed was a visceral, animalistic struggle. Marie Antoinette stood before her son's bed for an hour, defying the guards, her body a physical barrier between the child and the state. She screamed, she pleaded, she threatened to kill herself, but the revolution was indifferent to maternal instinct. They threatened to kill both her children if she did not comply. When she finally stepped aside, her spirit underwent a fundamental fracture. The boy was taken to a lower floor of the prison to be re-educated by a cobbler named Simon, a man whose pedagogical methods consisted of alcohol, beatings, and the forced singing of revolutionary anthems. Marie Antoinette would spend her remaining days in the temple, standing by a small crack in the floorboards, hoping to catch a glimpse of her son as he was led across the courtyard, listening to the muffled sounds of his voice as he was taught to curse her name. The cruelty of the state intensified as the summer waned. In August, she was awakened in the middle of the night and told she was being moved. She was not told where. She was taken from her daughter and her sister-in-law, stripped of her remaining personal effects, and transported to the conciergerie. This was the antechamber of the Guillotine, a medieval fortress on the banks of the Seine that served as the final stop for those destined for the blade. Her cell was a damp subterranean vault, several feet below the level of the river, where the walls wept saltpeter and the air was thick with the smell of rot. There was no privacy. 2 gendarmes were stationed in her cell 24 hours a day, separated from her only by a low screen. They watched her dress, they watched her sleep, they watched her pray. She was a woman suffering from frequent hemorrhages, her health collapsing under the weight of malnutrition and grief, yet she was denied even the basic dignity of solitude. In this tomb, she became a hollowed-out version of herself. She spent her hours knitting with threads pulled from the tapestries on the wall, using toothpicks as needles, a queen reduced to the mechanical motions of a peasant in a desperate attempt to keep her mind from unraveling. Inside this stone cage, the internal monologue of Marie Antoinette became a meditation on the nature of betrayal. She thought of the faces of the courtiers who had once bowed so low they nearly touched the floor, many of whom were now the very men signing her death warrants. She thought of the letters she had sent to her family in Austria, realizations dawning on her that her brother, the emperor, had prioritized the stability of his own borders over the life of his sister. She was a woman who had been traded for an alliance, and now that the alliance was dead, she was a liability to everyone. The Carnation Plot, a desperate attempt by a loyalist to rescue her by smuggling a note inside a flower, only served to tighten her security. Every flicker of hope was met with a more crushing weight of surveillance. She began to understand that the revolution did not just want her dead, it wanted to prove that she had never been sacred. It wanted to strip away the myth of her royalty until there was nothing left but a frightened, middle-aged woman shivering in a damp cell. The climax of this systematic dehumanization was the trial, which began on October 14, 1793. The Revolutionary Tribunal was not a court of law. It was a theater of vengeance. Marie Antoinette was led into the courtroom, her white hair hidden under a simple widow's cap, her body so thin that her black dress hung from her frame like a flag of surrender. The prosecutor, Fouquier-Tinville, A man whose soul had been replaced by a legalistic bloodlust leveled a series of accusations against her that ranged from high treason to the depletion of the national treasury. But the most grotesque moment arrived when he accused her of incestuous acts with her son. It was a charge so monstrous, so clearly fabricated to alienate her from the sympathies of the common people, that for a moment the courtroom fell into a shocked silence. This was the turning point where the prisoner regained her majesty. She did not answer the prosecutor. She turned to the audience, to the market women and mothers who had come to watch her fall, and she spoke directly to them. She appealed to the heart of every mother present, asking if such a crime were even possible. In that moment, the gendered hatred of the revolution faltered. The women in the gallery, many of whom had marched on Versailles years before, felt a shiver of recognition. They saw not a queen, but a mother being shredded by a machine that had no soul. But the machine would not be denied. The verdict was a foregone conclusion, written in the blood of the king and the paranoia of the Committee of Public Safety. At 4 o'clock in the morning on October 16th, after 2 days of relentless interrogation, the sentence was read: death. Marie Antoinette received the news with a terrifying composure. She was returned to her cell to write one final letter to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth. In these lines, she spoke of her children, her conscience, and her forgiveness for those who had brought her to this end. She did not write with the flair of a martyr, but with the weary clarity of someone who had already crossed the threshold of the living. She apologized for nothing, for to apologize would be to validate the madness that was about to consume her. She prepared herself, as if for a final grim audience. The transition from the trial to the execution was a cold, procedural countdown. The executioner, Henri Sanson, arrived at her cell to perform the toilette. This was the ritualistic stripping of the prisoner's remaining identity. Her hands were bound behind her back, a humiliation never forced upon the king. Her hair, the white crown of her suffering, was shorn and burned. She was not given a carriage for her final journey, as Louis had been, but was placed in an open cart, exposed to the elements and the insults of the crowd. The route to the scaffold was a gauntlet of human cruelty. People lined the streets to scream obscenities at the woman they blamed for their hunger, their wars and their fears. She sat upright, her gaze fixed over the heads of the mob, looking at something they could not see. She was no longer participating in their world. The guillotine was waiting in the square, its blade gleaming with a dull, indifferent light. It was the only thing in Paris that offered her a conclusion. The machine was ready to perform its singular task, to turn the widow Capet back into a footnote of history. The air was cold, the sky was a flat, unmoving grey, and the drums began to beat once more, signaling that the time for words had passed and the time for steel had arrived. 4. The wood of the tumbrel is rough, unplaned and damp with the morning mist, a brutal contrast to the velvet and gilded springs of the carriages that once defined her life. Marie Antoinette sits on a simple wooden plank, her hands bound tightly behind her back, her posture a defiant rejection of the gravity that seeks to pull her down into the mud. The streets of Paris have become a river of human resentment, a churning tide of faces that scream and jeer as the cart jolts over the uneven cobblestones. This is the ultimate theatre of the revolution, the desacralization of a living icon. Every jolt of the cart sends a shock through her spine, a reminder of her physical vulnerability in a world that no longer recognizes her soul. She does not look at the crowd. She looks through them, her eyes fixed on some invisible horizon where the noise of the mob cannot reach. The painter Jacques-Louis David stands in a doorway, his charcoal scratching against paper, capturing her image in a few swift, brutal lines. He does not draw a queen. He draws a woman whose jaw is set in a mask of frozen endurance, a woman who has already moved beyond the reach of her enemies. The air is cold, smelling of wood smoke and the iron-scented breath of thousands of spectators. This journey is the final distillation of the human condition, the moment when the individual is stripped of every social construct, every title and every protection, left with nothing but the raw capacity to suffer and the choice of how to meet the end. The guillotine waits at the end of this road, a silent vertical axis around which the entire world is now spinning. It is the only honest thing left in France, a machine that does not care for ideology or bloodlines, a machine that offers the only mercy the Republic has left, the mercy of the irreversible. The procession reaches the Place de la Révolution, and the scale of the collapse becomes undeniable. The vast square is packed with a humanity that has turned execution into a civic festival. In the center, the scaffold rises like a dark altar, the red-painted wood of the guillotine standing tall against the pale, unmoving sky. The blade, high and heavy, catches the light with a dull, predatory glint. As the cart stops, the Queen looks up at the machine. She does not flinch. There is a terrifying clarity in her gaze, the look of someone who has finally understood the geometry of her own destruction. She's helped down from the cart, her movements restricted by the ropes at her wrists. As she climbs the wooden steps, the sound of her footsteps on the hollow boards echoes across the square, a lonely, rhythmic beat that marks the final seconds of a millennium of monarchy. In her haste and her diminished vision, she accidentally steps on the foot of Henri Sanson, the executioner. Even here, at the very edge of the abyss, the habits of a lifetime manifest in a final, quiet flash of grace. She murmurs an apology, a ghost of the etiquette that once governed the most powerful court on earth. It is a moment of profound, shattering humanity, a reminder that beneath the political symbol, beneath the Austrian woman and the enemy of the people, there is a person who still remembers how to be kind. The mechanics of the end are swift and procedural. She is positioned on the plank, her neck placed in the wooden collar. The sky is the last thing she sees, a vast indifferent grey that offers no omens and no miracles. The executioner releases the lever. The friction of the rope, the sliding of the blade, and the heavy metallic thud of the impact happen in a single compressed heartbeat. The silence that follows is not the silence of peace but the silence of a vacuum. When the executioner lifts her head by the hair to show it to the crowd, the roar that erupts is a primal, hungry sound, the sound of a collective that has finally tasted the blood of its gods. But as the echoes of the Vive la République fade into the cold air, a different kind of reality begins to settle over the square. The Queen is dead, but the hunger that killed her remains. The machine has been fed, but its appetite has only been whetted. The death of Marie Antoinette was not the end of the revolution's violence. It was the moment the revolution lost its last inhibition. The aftermath of this execution is a testament to the corrosive nature of power and the tragic inertia of historical trauma. The young Dauphin, the boy for whom Marie Antoinette had fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal, was left to rot in a dark cell in the temple. He would die 2 years later, a victim of neglect, disease, and the psychological torment of a state that feared a child's bloodline more than it valued its own proclaimed virtues. The daughter, Marie-Thérèse, would survive as the orphan of the temple, the only member of the immediate family to walk out of that prison alive, carrying with her the heavy, silent burden of a world that had vanished overnight. The revolution, having consumed the king and queen, turned its gaze upon itself. The very men who had signed the death warrants, Robespierre, Danton, Saint-Just, would soon find themselves climbing the same wooden steps, feeling the same cold wind on their necks, and meeting the same indifferent blade. The guillotine became the ultimate equalizer, a machine that proved that in the eyes of a radicalized state, everyone is eventually a traitor. The blood of the Queen did not bring bread to the hungry or peace to the streets. It brought the Great Terror, a year of paranoid slaughter where the revolution attempted to purify itself by cutting away its own heart. History often treats Marie Antoinette as a caricature of decadence or a martyr of tradition, but the truth is far more uncomfortable. She was a human being caught in the gears of a transition she could not understand and a resentment she could not contain. Her life reveals the terrifying speed at which social order can dissolve when the gap between the rulers and the ruled becomes an abyss. Her final mistake was not her extravagance or her political intrigues. It was her belief that the world she was born into was permanent. She lived in a bubble of perceived inevitability, unaware that the floor beneath her was made of the very people she considered invisible. When the floor finally gave way, there was nothing to catch her but the blade. Her death reveals that power is not a possession, but a temporary loan from the collective, and when that loan is called in, the interest is paid in blood. As we look back at the cold, procedural reality of her end, we are forced to confront the mirrors of our own time. We live in an era where the language of resentment is once again a dominant currency, where the lines between political justice and collective vengeance are often blurred. The story of Marie Antoinette is not a costume drama. It is a psychological warning. It asks us to consider the nature of our own complicity in the systems that govern us. If you had been in that crowd in 1793, would you have been the one screaming for blood? Would you have been the one sharpening the blade or the one standing in the shadows, silent and paralyzed by the fear of being the next target? At what point does the pursuit of a new world become an excuse for the destruction of the human soul? History does not execute only kings and enemies. It executes the indifferent, the unaware, and the ordinary people who believed they were safe because they followed the rules of a world that no longer exists. The guillotine still stands in the collective memory, a silent witness to the fact that when a society loses its ability to see the humanity in its enemies, it is only a matter of time before it loses its own. Marie Antoinette went to her death with a dignity that her life had rarely required, proving that while power can be stripped away in an instant, the way a person faces the void is the only true measure of their character. The drums have stopped, the square is empty, and the blade is clean, but the questions raised by her fall remain, echoing through the halls of every empire that believes itself to be eternal. We are all participants in the making of history, and the choices we make in the face of rising shadows determine whether we are building a future or merely preparing the scaffold for our own inevitable arrival. The silence of the Conciergerie and the roar of the Place de la Révolution are two sides of the same coin, a currency that we continue to trade today, often without realizing the cost until the blade is already in motion.